this next hour is dedicated to talking to some of our experts, most of who you've already met. Leslie Beck, who's our weed expert, Joni, who's our insect expert, Ursula, who's been talking to us about stressed plants in the deserts, and this is Victor Trujillo, who we have not, oh no, Lucero, I'm so sorry. Victor Lucero, who we have not met yet. So I'm gonna ask him to introduce himself if we've got mics to share.
Hi, I'm Victor Lucero. I work for New Mexico Forestry Division. I'm officed out of Santa Fe, and I'm the state's Forest Health Protection Coordinator.
So we've been going through these presentations pretty much on, using the whole hour. So now is your chance to ask questions of all of these experts. So please bring whatever questions you have to the ground. Jordan's going to moderate. Marisa and I are going to walk around with microphones, and if you want to ask a question, hold up your hand or come find us.
And also, online, they can ask questions in the chat.
And online, you can ask questions in the chat, and we'll have somebody watching that, and we'll get you on the mic too. All right, thanks everybody. Here's Joran.
All right, so yes, my job as moderator is to keep the conversation going. If things get slow, I'll tell another bad joke, so you don't want that. We've got some great expertise up here, and so what we're really looking for is the specific questions that you have as practitioners out in the field. And perhaps as a way to kind of start the conversation, I'm going to relay a little anecdote from earlier in my career when I was the horticulture agent with New Mexico State Extension here in Bernalillo County. In that role, one does a lot of site visits. Somebody calls and says, I've got a problem with my apple trees. Come out and look at them. So I go. And it's this backyard setting, just a normal backyard in Albuquerque, and he's got a nice big apple tree in the middle of the yard. And even from a distance, the bronzing of those leaves and kind of the little bit of curling of those leaves was really distinctive. As I got in closer, there was orange dust of spider mites in every crack and crevice of this tree. There were billions, I'm sure, of spider mites in this tree. I've never seen anything like it. So I start talking to the gentleman, what's going on? Because, I've never seen this. Well, he was concerned about codling moth in his apples. So he was spraying every week with malathion. He had no codling moth problem. He blew up all of his natural protection that would have kept those spider mites at a minimal level where nobody would have noticed them. They'd be there, but inconsequential. Well, he blew up that natural system so hard, and I'm not even sure malathion is registered that way. I don't know. But, homeowners, they can kind of do what they can get away with. So that just, kind of gets back to that idea of really carefully identifying what you have and getting some expert advice on how to deal with it. And don't just go in, both barrels blasting. You don't know what you're going to cause. So with that, let's open it up to questions from the audience. Do we have any? There we go, right over here.
Testing, all right.
Hey, thank you. Thanks, Jordan. Just quick question. In the Southwest, and I'm seeing it, here in Albuquerque as well, can you talk a little bit for someone who's new to the region in managing mistletoe? I've heard a lot about pruning it out, but I've started to see a lot of mistletoe appearing from pruning wounds. So I'm just kind of curious your perspectives on best management going forward.
So from the perspective of mistletoe, pruning it is probably the most predominant method of controlling. However, usually people don't prune away enough from where the mistletoe is actually visible. So mistletoe, being a parasitic plant, actually has haustoria that are actually sort of tendriling and going into the vascular bundles inside the branch itself. So it's usually recommended, if you have mistletoe on one branch, to basically just prune that branch off to try to get as much of the haustoria as possible. As far as some mention of herbicide usage, there has been mention that sort of painting a little bit of glyphosate on the mistletoe itself has been successful, but For the most part, that's really just sort of putting a Band-Aid on a giant wound because, again, that really doesn't have the ability to get that haustoria all that well. So surface level management, like just sort of cutting the mistletoe off itself, or I've heard some levels of surface burning if it's low enough to the ground or accessible enough. But again, if you can't get that haustoria, it's just not going to be successful. And so one of the things that we're actually going to be looking at New Mexico State University is this upcoming spring is looking at very small concentrated amounts of electricity over a period of time connected to the mistletoe to see if it can actually get that haustoria without hurting the tree. So that's an upcoming project that I have. So hopefully maybe we might have another recommendation for that. But of course then you have to connect electricity to all the mistletoe in the tree. So there's really no silver bullet in that sense, but the best method typically to get rid of it is really just to try to prune out that entire branch, which of course stresses the tree. So proper pruning methods, proper timing is going to be more appropriate, and trying as much as possible not to let that mistletoe drop seed. So surface level removing it, cutting the mistletoe off itself can be helpful in the fact that it can't drop more seed, because birds love that seed, animals love that seed. That seed can survive for about 20 years in the soil. And so when a bird consumes it, it actually poops the seed back out on the branch, and that's how mistletoe spreads. So that's one way to prevent it from getting worse, if that makes sense. Thank you.
You probably also want to validate if it's true mistletoe versus dwarf mistletoe. One practice to managing dwarf mistletoe would actually be to identify the tallest plant, in the case of maybe ponderosa, and take some exaggerated measures to actually eliminate that particular host within the context of a planting, because again, dwarf mistletoe is not spread by birds. It's actually the seeds like forcefully dehisce, they explode, and that's how that seed is dispersed.
Well, one other method that has been published before is using Ethaphon sprays and trying to essentially kill the mistletoe that way, but that carries the risk of damaging the foliage of the tree. And I have not seen people like in southern Arizona use it, even though, you know, it is a possibility. So the pruning is definitely the one that is most prevalent.
Couple of other kind of off observations. One thing that we've done with some amount of success, at least in a limited time frame, is to go in and remove the exterior part of the mistletoe and then wrap a big section of that branch in like a black plastic that's basically going to starve light from getting to that mistletoe, and hopefully that will slow down regrowth. It doesn't necessarily eliminate the plant, and now you've got all these bits of plastic taped up in the tree, so not a perfect solution, but potentially a solution. The other thing I'll say is, having done some work, for instance, in Socorro on the New Mexico Tech campus, it's real host specific. Get rid of all those cottonwoods. Okay, other questions, concerns, thoughts? All right, wait, here we have some. All right, here we go.
Probably a concern.
Oh, from the chat. Okay, we're going to need to mic you up. It does seem also that, like we've heard a bit this conference, and a lot of us have heard before, stress trees do seem to be more susceptible to that population of mistletoe developing. And, you know, and then mistletoe stresses the tree. So it's this self-reinforcing cycle of eventually that canopy is green in the winter because it's all mistletoe.
All right, so George on Zoom asked earlier, he said, a quick question about water treatment on aphids. If the plant has a sensitive root system, would you recommend keeping the soil nice and dry? Cold and wet sounds like a perfect condition for the spiral of mortality.
Yeah, I mean, it depends, right, on your situation. Like, if you don't want to drench the soil, you got like a young plant, maybe that isn't the best idea to use. But, you know, the idea is that you're spraying them off. So if you have like a good way to not drench like the, you know, the roots and stuff, then that's good. But if not, then maybe utilizing some of those other strategies like biological control or, you know, your oils and your soaps. No, don't use the fire hose. No, sorry. Hey, shenanigans.
Great.
I'm gonna chip in just a tiny bit. I think the amount of water necessary to wash aphids off is not enough water to saturate a root zone.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
And
Except
so,
for like surface level roots, but not deep.
Because I haven't
Yeah.
heard of that being an issue personally, but you know, like there's all sorts of cases.
yeah, and maybe, so, you know, taking it away from trees and going to the vegetable garden, if your broccoli is covered in aphids and you're gonna approach it by spraying it off, you might actually make that soil too wet. But at that point, water is not your solution anyways. And so aphids I worry about on annual plants a lot more than I worry about on perennial plants.
Yeah.
On trees, generally, my recommendation is put your feet up and have a beer. And if you have a robust landscape, it is going to attract enough of these beneficials. Aphids are the candy of the insect world. They're soft-bodied, they're not very mobile, and there's lots of them. And
Right.
other things just gorge on them. And the aphids survive by basically having a life strategy that there's going to be so many of us, you can't eat us all.
Right.
Somebody's going to survive.
And that's why I had that slide of all the things that love to eat them, and I didn't even put every single bug that likes to eat them. They really are like favored by a lot of insects, and spraying them off actually helps those predators get to them as well, especially if there are ants involved. So, you know, kind of like two things at once.
Awesome. Thank you.
Cool. Another question. We don't listen to questions from you, Tracy.
Okay, all right. Pretend it's from her.
Okay.
We're dealing with honey locust borer up in Santa Fe, and it seems like they tend to attract mostly weak trees and old stress trees. I'm trying to decide whether or not to recommend honey locust anymore, or if the presence of the borer means we really shouldn't be planting them.
Yeah.
Can we confirm that, can the people online hear the questions? I think so, yeah? Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, and that's a hard one because, like, I have had, you know, I obviously didn't mention this in the top 5 because it didn't make the list, but I did have those sent to me through the plant diagnostics clinic. And yeah, wood borers, they do target stressed trees. So I don't, you know, it's hard. It's like if you can water that, you know, and you can afford that water use, like, sure, but I wouldn't be recommending to plant it personally, you know, like, it's a beautiful thing, but I don't know if it's practical.
If you're planting it in an area, if you're going to plant it in an area that's going to be perpetually stressed, and there's not much you can really do about that, then you're probably going to have more problems than you are benefits from that particular type of tree. And I wouldn't limit that strictly to honey locust. I would limit that, or would expand that to every tree. So pretty much when we see issues, with the exception of herbicide damage, it's usually as a result of a weakened system from the tree being stressed. But even herbicide damage can manifest itself more prominently in stressed trees. So if you can't maintain the tree appropriately, then try to choose another tree that might be more appropriate for that area, or maybe try to choose another plant.
Right. And I mean, y'all are tree people, so I'm sure you're aware of this, but there are a list of trees that are better suited for New Mexico, right? Like, that might be better options than like honey locust.
My experience with that particular animal in planted areas in urban sites is that they definitely do prefer stressed hosts. If I recall all of my experience with that animal on its host, and it is host specific to Gleditsia, is they love trees that have been planted way too deep, that don't get sufficient water. And if you recall it, that tree, I believe, is native to the Ohio River Valley, where it probably gets 30 plus inches of irrigation and in its natural setting. So if you can't afford that resource to the tree, as it's been mentioned, find a more suitable tree. But I have seen efforts to control that particular pest with insecticides applied, like when the insect, when the beetles start emerging, like in June, late June, based on some trap data. And it can be controlled, but it's, again, one of those things that is the tree being well maintained, well managed, and look for something else.
Right, and an important part about those insecticides is it's preventative. Like, you're not going to save a tree once they get inside of it, so that's important to think about too.
And I'm going to, just because I get the mic and I get to say stuff, I'm going to say something. I'm going to repeat something that a colleague and very learned practitioner, Eric Bishop, shared with me some time ago. He had the opinion that a lot of times when people say, that tree just doesn't do well for us here, it's how it was planted and maintained. It's not the species, it's the management and the installation that are really causing that root, pun intended, stress that is then making that tree susceptible. And so a lot of times we blame the tree for things we didn't do well.
Thank you. Yeah. Other questions? All right.
We've got another on chat.
Yes. Okay. So next one is Devin asks, Rainbird has a deep root watering product that is essentially a 3-foot length of PVC that delivers irrigation below the surface of the ground directly to the tree. It has also had studies done by the U of A. Is this method of irrigation any more or less effective than drip emitters spaced beneath the tree canopy or other irrigation?
Yes, I've done that study. And we have looked at the effect of using either surface irrigation with drip emitters, and it was more of a bubbler type of emitter. And then also using those, they almost look like cages, so it's not a PVC pipe that is just perforated. It looks like a very densely meshed wire cage, and it was installed, the 1-foot deep cage was installed next to hopbush, Dodonea viscosa, that we were planting, and the 3-foot one was installed next to ash and the Fraxinus arizonica. And we planted that in Tucson, installed it, and essentially the idea is that it will help in the establishment of the roots so that the roots can grow quickly out into the surrounding soil. And then we dug up the plants, I would say, after 3 and 6 months. It's been quite a while, so. And we looked at the root extension out of the original root ball, and we looked at the above ground biomass. Essentially, we looked at height and I think maybe caliper. And the only difference that we found among all, the 2 species and the treatment being either the surface irrigation or the Rainbird, what are they called? Like essentially the little cages that are installed right next to the root ball. The only difference that we found that was after either 3 or 6 months, the ash trees had more roots outside the original root ball. And it was probably after 3 months, because I think after 6 months we didn't see any differences anymore. So it was a temporary increase. Now, what is interesting, we used these installation methods in a loamy sand, and essentially, originally it was designed to be used in sandy soils, like in areas where you have 80% or more sand and where you have orchards like date orchards. And so there were a couple of things that made sense why the design was the way it was if you put it in sandy soil. But in our soil that had more finer particles, we then had a little bit of the soil particles essentially moving into this structure. And so it was not maybe quite as effective as it might have been in a sandy soil. But there was essentially a temporary aspect of improving the root growth, but it was not permanent, and there was no difference in the above ground biomass that we measured.
We've got one over here.
Real quick, because I got the stage. Watering deeply is important. And I define that as put enough water on the surface that it soaks down to your target depth, because it's that shallow part of the soil where all of the biota concentrates that we really want to get the roots into. And so if we introduce water too deep, we may be putting it below the best target for that soil. Put it on. How does water get into a soil naturally in most tree environments? It's rainfall. It hits the surface and then soaks in. And if we can mimic that, we're going to do better.
Good afternoon. More of an observation from my experience than anything as a question or anything that's been, I don't know, necessarily scientifically tested, but we've been using soil sponges, which are basically post holes filled with a soil mix. We use Mediterranean mix from Soilutions, but you could use a lot of different things. And I have put those out around the tree line and make sure there's irrigation over it. And you know, I know Jim Brooks has done some digging around this seeing, but it helps the water to infiltrate. It acts as an incubator for organic matter and building soil. And I brought back a bunch of trees that looked really super stressed. There's sort of multiple reasons it works well, but it's something that I would encourage other people to try if you haven't already.
Absolutely. And I think aside from all the advantages that Hunter just referred to, I think one of the big things that I take away from that is if I'm going to put something in the soil, I would rather put organic matter in the soil than plastic.
Yeah.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
My question is about transplanting some volunteer trees. So occasionally I find some volunteers, I'd like to replant them with different levels of success. So I got at my home, I got a southern magnolia that's pretty mature, and lo and behold, underneath it, there's a volunteer redbud. I don't know how it got there, although I got a redbud on the other side of the house. So anyway, as far as correctly transplanting a small volunteer, just like to know what's the good process, you know, maybe soak the roots in water, et cetera, et cetera. So what's the accepted practices?
I have opinions, of course. Get it as early in that tree's life as you can, because a seed-grown tree doesn't have its root system restricted by a pot, and pretty quickly that root system is expanding fairly good sized, and you may not take enough of the root. So maybe one approach is to start, okay, you've got this seedling, this seed-grown plant that you want to transplant. I'm going to transplant it next year. This year, I'm going to cut roots in place with a shovel to get them then to branch out in finer regrowth closer in, and then I can take more of the root system when I do move it. I'd love to hear other thoughts from the audience on this. Folks that have tried different things.
Like you, I always have an opinion too, Jordan. Couple things. One is a caution, depending on how long the seedling's been there. When you go to dig it up, you could be doing significant damage to the roots of the main tree, so you got to watch that. I think root pruning makes sense if it's not too big now, but as we know, redbuds don't tend to transplant here bare root worth a damn, so be sure and catch it little, and you might even consider either immediately get it into the place it's going, or pot it for a season and see if it's going to make the transplant.
Thanks.
Jordan, if I can jump in real quick.
Please.
I would say if you can, if it's a deciduous plant, do it when it's dormant. And if it's conifer, if it does start throwing candles out, don't do it then. Do it when the candles have hardened off.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense, Andrew. Time it with the phenology of the tree and what it's doing.
I have a backyard full of clay, hard clay, when I plant trees that the city gave me, thank you, City of Albuquerque, I dig a big hole through that hard clay and put in all the mulch and all the good soil that James Cassidy talked about. What about flower beds, the whole backyard? It's got to go, maybe what he just said about post holes. We just dig up that clay little by little.
One of the problems that we run into, if we have a heavy clay texture soil and we introduce a different texture, a much more organic material or something that's more of a loam or something, if we don't blend that edge, we create a barrier. Because water, if you introduce it to the new soil, that water is going to be held in that new soil until it's super saturated, and only then will it begin to cross into the clay. Conversely, if you water the clay and not the introduced soil, that water is not going to move out of the clay into the introduced soil. I'm only half joking when I say if you're trying to grow a lot of stuff on clay soil, your best option is to sell it and move. You're not going to change a clay soil from being a clay soil. You can add organic matter and improve that clay soil, but it's a clay soil. And to that extent, I would add organic matter very broadly and diffusely, and not in concentrated pockets.
So I had another piece of information here. Many years ago, my colleague and I did a study with the city of Tucson, because at that point it was still very popular to add organic amendment in the backfill. So, you know, after you have dug your hole 2 to 3 times as wide as the container, you add backfill in and mix the soil with some kind of, you know, compost maybe. So we did this using 1/3 or half of the backfill by volume. We used organic material. And what happened was, after 2-3 years, some of the plants that had the higher percentage of organic backfill, they started to lean by 10, 15, up to 20 degrees. And the reason why they started to lean is when you're having this organic material at the base of the tree, of course it gets irrigated. Where is also the biggest breakdown of organic material that is wet in a warm climate? Exactly in that area. So you're creating voids then. And so essentially there was not enough soil, mineral soil anymore there that could anchor, that could support that original root ball well enough. And then, so essentially we said, you know, don't do this, you know, just backfill it with the mineral soil and then just use mulch on top to get that slow increase of organic material. And then on another call that I had out of Phoenix, where in the median, some ground covers that had been there for 10, 12 years, they were dying in massive amounts, like, you know, miles. And so after doing a lot of forensic horticulture, we determined that it was the organic material that had been mixed in with the planting holes and in with essentially the soil, which is often, of course, extremely poor soil, you know, in the median between, you know, some very wide streets, probably was all compacted, and maybe that's why they added that. But there were large chunks, most likely, of that organic material that then degraded very quickly, and so it created holes, and at some point there just wasn't enough soil anymore with enough water holding capacity to maintain the root system of those plants.
So I talked to Dr. Beck about this last night. Wanted to see if there's any other opinions on it. So if you are applying an herbicide or fungicide or something like that, and you accidentally get it on a desired plant, is there any remedy you can do immediately after or follow up, or you just basically SOL and have to buy the customer a new plant?
Well, I mean, you talked to me already, so is that...
But go ahead and answer it for all.
Okay. Sorry, the answer for everybody, sorry. Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned last night, that it really sort of depends on what's being applied. If it's, if it is a contact herbicide, meaning that you're probably going to get immediate injury to the plant, it's probably hard to remedy that at that point because you're probably going to get immediate burn back of the plant even if you do try to wash it off. If it is a type of systemic, it would matter if it's foliar absorbed only or if it's root absorbed or both. If you were to wash it off at that point, then if it's root absorbed as well, you might just be introducing it into the soil where the roots can take it up. As far as the understanding that you did accidentally spray something over a plant that was desirable, I would say it is possible to just go ahead and wash it off at that point. That might be the best recourse, and just sort of see past that point, because even if you do get it into the soil, maybe it's like glyphosate and it's bound by the soil, so it's not going to be taken up by the root system after that point. But once the herbicide starts manifesting injury in the plant itself, especially if it is a systemic, it's really just too late at that point. So I don't know if that kind of answers your question or if anybody wants to sort of add on to that. Washing it off is probably going to be your best recourse if it's possible to do, but again, it's just going to depend on what was applied, how it was applied, how much of it actually contacted the beneficial plant, and whether that's recoverable at that point. I mean, if it was just like a little, I sneezed, whatever, maybe it's recoverable by that point, but if you accidentally sprayed over a desirable plant, then you're probably not going to be able to avoid any type of injury after that point. Whether it needs to be replaced or not, I would say go ahead and wait and see if the plant is able to actually grow out of that before going ahead and just destroying it, if that makes sense.
I think that's a really important nuance there, that it depends, right? What chemical and how is it active, and where does it stabilize, and you might wash something off and not wash something else off.
Exactly, yeah.
Chips from chipper trucks. Most all of us are fans of using it. Can you folks just address, as we discuss using chips to our customers, a lot of people will say, oh my gosh, this will contain this bug, this will contain mistletoe if it came out of a mistletoe tree infested with mistletoe, et cetera, et cetera. How deep should I put it? If you guys can just address that, that'd be great.
I mean, I kind of addressed it yesterday in my presentation from a herbicide perspective, because if that tree was killed by a specific type of herbicide, like aminopyralid, for instance, it may be that herbicide is still active in those chips and introducing that mulch into an area where trees are, or vegetative plants that are desirable, then that herbicide can still remain active. So it sort of depends on what the tree died from, in that sense, if it was killed on purpose and then mulched. If you can get that information, as much information as you can get about where that mulch came from, what contributed to that mulch, is going to be much more beneficial. I would always say, before you introduce any type of mulch, organic matter, even soil, doesn't matter if you buy it at Home Depot or if you get it from the city, test it first before you put it in your vegetable garden or put it around your trees. Just putting it into a little pot, even the wood chips, as we were talking about, throw a little native soil in there. Plant those beans and those pea seeds. They should come up in a few days, and if they come up warped, then maybe that's not going to be the best thing. From the perspective of insects or other type of contaminants, I'll let you guys cover that.
I've read studies about the benefits of chipping and just the mechanical action to kill either overwintering stages, larvae or pupae. For example, I think it's a gold-spotted oak borer, where that action actually warrants control of that particular pest. I can't speak, unfortunately, to the mistletoe.
I think on the mistletoe, what you would have to be careful about is to have something that doesn't have any seeds, which would then could then be taken up. But otherwise, if you just have the green vegetative material from the mistletoe, I don't know that this would be detrimental. I doubt it, but I haven't read any studies about it.
I haven't read any studies about allelopathic compounds or anything associated with mistletoe that if in its green herbaceous state present in that mulch would be detrimental. I was about to say, we just want to try to make sure that there weren't seed attached to that, or seed within the area. But that would be hard to determine because, as I mentioned, some mistletoe seed can stay active in the soil for about 20 years before they ever germinate. So I would say probably maybe incorporate some sort of moisture into that area, or like if you have a pile, maybe water it, see what comes up if you have a lot of weed seed present in there, or maybe even mistletoe seed. But that's I mean, that's a way to check, but I doubt that's going to net you, 100%, the feeling that you're not going to have any kind of contaminants in that mulch. Sometimes you just got to apply it and hope for the best. But if it's likely that there was mistletoe present in the trees that were mulched, at least, like I said, get as much background on that, where that mulch came from as possible. You can be aware of that. And as mistletoe starts to become a problem, then hopefully that management can occur before it becomes a widespread problem and starts contributing more seed, if that makes sense. Sometimes being aware is your best tool.
So there is a concern when conifers are chipped, for example, and the timing of such action. For example, if you're chipping a pinyon pine in a landscape in June or July, the volatiles of that event will draw in bark beetles and subsequently attack any residual trees. So I just mention that because that could be a proverbial train wreck, drawing in an unwanted situation specific with conifers.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. I was like, oh yeah, the ips, because it's not the chips themselves, but that smell that attracts them. So yeah, there's like certain times of the year where, you might actually attract those wood-boring beetles.
All right, opinion time. Insects, and to maybe a lesser degree, diseases that live in an intact tree need an intact tree as their habitat. When I run it through a chipper and spread it out in a 2-inch layer in the sun, I have changed that habitat. And I think a lot of stuff isn't going to survive that. I would be maybe concerned with recently killed pine mulching around a pine, but if I mulched under my apple tree with some stuff that had pinon in it and it drew in ips to my apple tree, I don't care. They're not going to find anything there.
Right, and that's why, I wasn't thinking to say anything, because I'm like, because you're chopping it up, they're desiccating, but the attractant part's where I think the bug question comes into play.
And the other thing, and this I'm going to pose to you as a question, the kinds of organisms the kinds of insects and mites and things like that are going to find a mulch layer as an attractive habitat, are they generally considered landscape pests or even household pests? I'm going to posit that by and large, no. And so what I tell clients is, yes, it's going to attract insects, the kind that live in mulch.
Decomposers.
And decompose it. And return all that organic matter. And unless you get down in there with them, you're not going to know they're there.
That's a good point. It's pretty understudied, decomposers with wood chipping and stuff. So there actually might be some good stuff going on that we don't really know too much about.
We have a question right up front here, or first over there.
Just a real quick clarification. I really enjoyed the talk about how to find out how much water to give the trees based on those qualifiers. And I just want to make sure that I understood correctly. That helps you calculate how much water that plant's going to want in a month's span, correct?
The example that I gave was for the month span, for the month of June, the ETO, the historical ETO for Albuquerque. And so you would put in, whatever works for you. You can put in 2 weeks if you know you want to water every 2 weeks. And let's say you want to look at January and February, for example, where your ETO is very low. You look at the historical or your actual ETO, if you can get that for, 2025, and then you can calculate how much water would that tree need, and then you would decide, yes, it's a good time at the end of February to give that much water. But you also have to take into consideration, you know, what your plant factor is, whether you have a conifer or whether you have a dormant tree, like especially for the winter time. So it was just that the example was, because I had that ETO data for Albuquerque, you can use any time span. Like in Tucson or in Phoenix, we can get enough ETO in 1 week or even less than a week that we need to irrigate the high water use plants. So.
There's a neighborhood in Albuquerque that I encountered about 1.5 years ago that had just been sprayed, maybe repeatedly, with, you know, gaps and cracks, weeds on the asphalt and between sidewalks. And every fraxinus tree in that neighborhood was severely harmed. And I'm just like wondering, how do we let that happen, and what can we do to make it not happen more?
Sure. So it's kind of hard to answer that question in a generalization. It would depend on what they applied. In some cases that I have heard tell, I've not seen this in action or anything like that, some of the products that have been used in that sense have longevity in the soil. If that's the case, then it being present on the sidewalk, if it's at a risk of movement, you know, into soil-based areas, if there's rainfall, if there's irrigation, and maybe even up to several weeks after that application. So how to avoid that in the future, I would say try to utilize herbicides that don't have longevity in that sense, that break down really quickly. That might be a good opportunity for organic options if the budgets allow for that, since it basically just burns off the surface and you don't necessarily have to worry about it washing into the soil. There are herbicides that would be, I think, better fit for that, but without knowing what they sprayed, it's hard to know, you know, what happened there. My guess is likely it was not a product that would be applicable in that situation and not have to worry about it moving off-site and hurting trees in that sense. And I have heard of that in some situations in the past with certain herbicide active ingredients. So, like I said, moving forward, trying to utilize products that don't have that likelihood. Unfortunately, that's kind of become a little bit more prevalent in the absence of being able to make applications with glyphosate because of the glyphosate bans. So the alternative products that are being used are not what I would be considered to be conducive to that area without possible off-site damage. So I don't know if that necessarily answers your question or not, but it's really unfortunate that that happened. And I'm trying my best to talk to a lot of the municipalities and a lot of different cities around the state. I've actually given presentations, given materials, talking about these specific types of things, talking about implementing more integrated pest management practices, which a lot of them are, and really putting those at the forefront and utilizing herbicides as a last result. So I think as far as what's going on and what I've experienced, there's a lot of things moving in the right direction, but it also depends on who made that application, what application that was, what was the you know what I mean? So it's really unfortunate that that happened. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question or not, or if it was a question or just.
And then kind of to tack onto that, I think there's this problem of expectation versus reality. So
exactly, yeah.
The homeowner's expectation, or the homeowners association expectation, even worse, is there will be no weeds in any cracks in the sidewalks without understanding that tree roots grow under the cracks.
Exactly.
And we have diagnosed herbicide damage in an ash tree that was a good 50 feet away, the edge of the canopy, 50 feet or more away from the crack that the material was applied in the parking lot, and it translocated. And so it's education of the client, and it's education of the applicators. And, you know, unfortunately, we're preaching to the choir in here.
Sure.
How do we preach to the Philistines out there that are doing this? I don't know.
We're trying our best. I mean, I'm giving as many talks as possible. I'm trying to foster relationships with a lot of the municipalities who are making these applications and are expected to control these in certain ways. But also, just like was mentioned, was talking about the realistic aspects of just because there's a plant there doesn't mean we have to spray it. But there are certain situations where safety is involved. We can't have, excessive amounts of growth over cracks because that might hurt someone. So it's all about finding that balance in the sense. Yeah. I think I might have done.
My question, I don't expect like a specific answer to, more just your thoughts.
6.
But I get called out to clients' houses all the time, and usually when they call me out, it's because the tree is sick, right? And by the time I get there, it's too late. The tree is dead, okay?
Oh, yeah.
So I guess my question is to you, the experts, is given that we're under the gun with heat, with climate change, with temperature, how do we communicate that our trees are under the gun, our landscapes are under the gun, to the people that aren't in this conference?
Yeah, and that's sorry.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just got a note that there's a dump truck or a trash truck that is trying to empty a dumpster, and they're going to tow these 3 cars: a white Jeep RRX 561, a Pontiac MHZ 285, and a 4-door Jeep Wrangler BYH W62. Go ahead. Yeah.
That sounds serious.
Act now or pay the fee.
Well, that's a really good question. And, it really does come down to communication, right? Like science communication, education, informal STEM education. It's tough. Like, Dr. Beck and I, we do a lot of this where we go to all sorts of areas across the state to, give workshops and classes. And sometimes, if it's more a general event, like you can get folks that might not know that information, and you hope that they transfer that to other people, but it's really just going out there and having events for people to learn this information, because it is hard, right? I'm still figuring that out, right? An extension, like that's our job, is to go around and educate folks, but getting to the right folks takes a lot of work and boots on the ground. But thankfully, we have wonderful county agents across the state that we can work with, like, Will and John and Bonnie, everybody. Yeah, there's all sorts of awesome folks that, just working with other different associations like plant societies, having, I went to Rio Doso in October. They had at the community college where they had these like nights where anyone from the town could come and watch these science talks, and they loved it. And it was really cool to reach out to people who didn't know things about integrated pest management and, native grasses being good for bugs. So it's just, sometimes it takes a little bit of work, but I think that we all 4 or 5 of us here have some sort of thoughts on that.
One thing that I think you can learn from any, killed tree is do some forensic analysis. I mean, I think that's probably how somebody's going to find emerald ash borer in New Mexico. A tree dies, and what happened? And somebody's going to peel bark back, and they're going to see serpentine galleries. But I think you could learn a lot from just the fact that a tree, succumbed to the elements. But also from the perspective of what I do now is to manage landscapes for hotter and drier conditions. I mean, we've heard excellent talks this morning about the benefits of mulch and organic matter, yet how many decomposed granite mulch sites do we see where there's trees struggling? So I think repetition is a good teacher, and I think if we continue to talk the talk and actually implement some of these practices that we learn year after year, I think that's a good thing.
I mean, I was going to say, like, just because the tree dies doesn't mean it's the end of the world. There's always an opportunity to learn about what happened to get to that point and to move forward beyond that point. Another aspect is communicating to our clientele some of the options that they have if the tree is starting to look sick. How do they get answers as to what might be going on before it is too late? So the plant diagnostic clinic would be a really good example of that. So That's why we really try to keep our services free as much as possible so people are more encouraged to send in their samples. And try to get answers when there might be a semblance of a remedy rather than, or to be more proactive rather than reactive in that sense.
I think also in terms of trying to educate people to be proactive, to ensure that the plants are healthy and that they can stay healthy, because if people only pay somebody to come into their landscape to prune, mow, blow, and cart everything away, this is not going to ensure long-term a healthy landscape. And so if you can give people options, you know, this would be the minimum care, like adding mulch or doing an irrigation, doing a survey of the irrigation, are the emitters where they are, what is, you know, the general distribution uniformity, do you actually have the right setup for your irrigation clock, and very simple things like that. And if there can be like a checklist just to help people understand what it takes to maintain a healthy tree, instead of letting things go to a point where there's no return or where there's very little return.
One other thing you might think about doing, it takes some of your time, but see if you can find neighborhood association meetings, church group meetings, and offer to come in and talk to them for 10 minutes about, you know, kind of general ideas about tree care, and don't use it to hard sell your business. Leave some cards, because you'll get a call or two, but just do it as a donation of education to people who haven't already self-selected to come learn about this, right? We need to, again, get to those people who, plants, whatever. No, you're the one that needs to hear this, right? So, I mean, it's a donation of your time, but it's public education. And networking. Yeah, I mean, you give away your time, but you might sell some work.
Okay, all right, so then remind me. Okay, there was somebody else. I lost track.
Back to the idea of coming up with new choices because of climate change, we are starting to use a lot more oaks in Santa Fe, and I'm curious as to your take on potential pest problems popping up in the future as they get planted more and more. And specifically, we're using a lot of Schumerton, Texas red oaks, and I know there is a very serious red oak borer in Texas and in Michigan. What do you think the likelihood is it's going to wind up here?
Yeah, and that's a great question, because, you know, oaks do need water. And some are more drought resistant than others, you know, just really depends. I personally haven't dealt with any oak borers yet. You know, that's a big yet. The things that I have dealt with are things like the aphids and, oh gosh,
Kermes scale.
Yes, scales, and the gall wasps, a lot of gall wasps. Those are, I would say, the top ones that I've had sent in, which aren't, you know, terrible pests to have, annoying, but nothing that's like as devastating as a borer. But that would be something to keep an eye on, and I'll keep an eye on it yet as well. I haven't seen it yet, like I said, but you know, it's not out of the realm of possibility. But I'd prefer it over honey locust. So, you know.
I would say from a weeds perspective, the majority of the issues that we have with mistletoe in Texas is going to be on oak trees. So oak trees do foster some mistletoe. There are some species that are a little bit more resistant to those than others. What those are, I'm not exactly certain. I could probably do some research and get back to you if you'd like to email me. But that would be another thing to sort of keep an eye out for, is developing mistletoe situations.
Hi, I have a question about rock mulch. Specifically with like extreme heat becoming more of an issue with trees. Like I know city of Albuquerque, all of the medians, all of the greenways, like so much of the space that the city controls is just like default rock mulch, and a lot of the commercial spaces as well. So could y'all talk about like, I don't know, issues around that on a systemic level and how to address that going forward?
I can just say real quick that the standard details for planting for City of Albuquerque and Bernalillo County are changing to include wood mulch underneath trees. There is still rock mulch outside of the wood mulch, but at least there's an area that's dedicated to wood mulch. Yeah. And a certain circumference around the tree. But please do address the question anyway. It's still valid.
So rock mulch can absorb more heat and re-radiate more heat, but it really depends on it depends on the color. So if it's a lighter or a darker color, it also. I'm trying to remember the details because I read a paper about this not too long ago. But not everything was intuitive, and there are times when the rock mulch was actually superior to bare soil, which was surprising to me. But overall, we know, of course, of the benefits of the organic mulch, and I think when you're looking at all the different aspects that can be measured, like in terms of soil temperature and the conservation of water and such, and adding organic matter, then at that soil mulch interface, the organic mulch would definitely be preferred, and the rock mulch does have the ability to really increase the re-radiation. And I'm trying to think, there was something about the night temperatures. Maybe it did increase the night temperatures too, so it could further increase that respiration during the hot nights, because it absorbs more of the heat.
Hi, Joran.
Hey, Sarah.
Can I respond to this too?
Please.
I love talking about rock mulch. Like, don't add any more rock mulch. So I've also been working with the City of Albuquerque, and we're in the process of completely changing the design process manual to include green stormwater infrastructure and to eliminate weed fabric in any green stormwater infrastructure feature and include only organic mulch. Thank you. We're gonna need your help, support, so keep clapping, because we're gonna need you as backup when all of this comes out. So I think the thing is that we need to change the way we do business, not only around our trees, but in the rest of our landscapes. Yeah. And we need, in the vein of our friend Judith Phillips, take back the landscape from the gravel spreaders. Some Judith Phillips fans in the room. And so please keep your eyes out for those changes, because we're gonna need everybody's support in this room to make sure that that goes through. So, thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. And keep up the good work. One thing that you'll hear from people that spread and maintain gravel mulches and rock mulches is that the maintenance is easier. I will give them that. It doesn't migrate with wind and water as much. So we've traded plant performance for convenience and ease. Folks, we need to quit doing that kind of thing. Hire some more people, send them out there with hand tools, get them to clean the weeds out, get them to rake the mulch back in. Rock mulch doesn't decompose in biological time. It decomposes in geological time, and so eventually, yes, it builds soil, but not to the degree that's going to benefit that tree that's there now. So we want to benefit that tree. Now, 2 exceptions. I have a really hard time growing fig trees in my backyard. They winter die. I'm going to mulch around them with rock. But that's a very specific heat-requiring tree. And I'm going to do that so that in the winter, hopefully that immediate environment around the tree in the root zone doesn't get as cold. I don't know if it's going to work, but those, and then if you're doing something truly xeric, if you're planting cacti and yucca, a shallow rock mulch is kind of their natural habitat. So again, it's when we start to mix a mesic tree into a rock xeriscape, there's a mismatch. Eric.
and try to understand what plants work best with what mulch, what areas work better with an organic mulch. I don't believe in a one-fit solution for everything.
Amen.
I think that's a very lazy way to think in any industry.
Yeah.
I have one more comment on the rock and gravel mulch because you mentioned the cactus and succulents. So there has been a study that was done quite a while ago in Arizona checking the benefits of organic or rock mulch for the use around cactus and succulents. And rock mulch is preferred because the organic mulch can keep actually a site especially closer to the cactus, which doesn't have as defined of a single tree, of a single trunk like a tree, and it actually can lead to some diseases. So for cactus and succulents, actually rock mulch may be the more, the better adapted choice, or maybe bare soil.
So everybody, just real quick, we're out of time. I know there's more questions. We wanted to give everybody either an opportunity to ask more questions if it's cool with the panelists, or give everybody a chance who wants to take a break to take a break. We have a 30-minute break on the schedule now, but I know people want to keep talking. So do what suits you if it's cool with everybody.
Yeah.
A couple more minutes is fine.
So I wanted to piggyback on something that Eric was saying, and that's particle size. If I'm going to rock mulch, I'm going to use a larger piece. The worst rock or mineral mulch you could put around trees is crusher fines, right? Crusher fines are great for doing pathways, but they compact so well that they really limit water and gas exchange more than we want. So if you're going to use a rock mulch, use a larger size. So other questions?
For those of you who are taking a break, we are still answering questions, so thank you.
What disease and or pathogen are you not looking forward to identifying in the future? Something on the horizon.
Well, that's a loaded question.
Like the ultimate.
I mean, it depends. I mean, if you're a chili grower, you know, you don't want curly top virus, right? There's quite a few. I don't know, like it just really. I don't like it when people call me about wood borers because it's sad because I can't really do anything about it.
Yeah, probably, you know, the emerald ash borer or the Asian longhorn borer we'd hate to get. In terms of diseases, I'm not as sure, and we don't have Dr.
Like something
Lujan
that's
with
not
us.
here yet is what he's saying?
Yeah, I think you're referring to something new that might be coming in. And in the weed realm, there's probably things.
Yeah, as far as the weed realm goes, and this is something that you guys can kind of be on the lookout for, we did recently have a brand new weed that appeared in New Mexico that's never been here before. It's native to Mexico. It's called dry-Mary sandwort. It is highly, highly toxic to livestock, and the reason that we discovered that it was there is that it killed roughly about 30 elk and cattle in the Gila wilderness just by consuming, I think, roughly like 0.0005% of their body weight of the plant. That's all it takes. So in theory, we were able to sort of get on that and sort of eradicate that, but it got here somehow. So if dry-Mary sandwort is starting to show up in areas, that's a big concern. Probably from the weed perspective, the biggest concern from me and other weed specialists is going to be the resistance issue that's going on, and it's continuing to get worse. There's also associations with how these pests are moving and where they're located in regards to climate change. So we're dealing with weed movement into areas that have never existed before because the temperatures are changing and the moisture amounts are changing. So we have weeds that are coming down, you know, coming up from the southern areas that are moving up further north where they never existed before. So that's probably encompasses a lot of different things, but that's what we're going to have to start dealing with here in the future. So just because a weed hasn't been present in the past doesn't mean it's not going to make its way there eventually.
There is, in our neighboring state of Arizona, my counterpart, they've been trapping Mediterranean pine engraver, which is a pest of Afghan pines. And so currently it's been identified in the Tucson area, I think is the eastmost area that they've trapped. And along that I-10 corridor, It's kind of a delicate area into Deming, Crucis, and so on and so forth, where that tree species does exist. So, and there's, again, with commerce and trade, and there's the potential for all sorts of critters to come into New Mexico.
One last question.
Hi, to touch back on the rock mulch option, I'm from the southern end of the state, and organic mulch is either very hard to find, very expensive, or blows away. So if you have to choose between a rock mulch and bare soil, which would you go with?
It depends.
Well,
It would
yes.
depend on plant. So I will say this about a rock mulch. It does cool the soil below and preserve moisture below. It does function as a mulch in that way. It heats up and dries up the air above, and that's the issue. That's a hard one. I don't know.
I'd
Ursula,
say pretty
you
much
might have
anything
some
is going to be
thoughts.
preferable over bare soil, especially our bare soils. So, of course, rock mulch would probably be at the lowest end of the totem pole in that regard, but a live root is always going to be better for the soil than any kind of mulch is going to be. So it's really sort of about that hierarchy, and it just like was mentioned, that depends. Like every situation and every tool that we utilize has benefits as well as pros and cons that we have to consider. So we really just have to tailor whatever it is we're trying to create in that environment, for our needs and for the plant themselves. And hopefully there's some sort of a tool or some sort of a substance that we can utilize that might satisfy all three of those ends of the triangle. And that's what we're really trying to do, rather than just generalize and say, expensive-wise, we can just do rock mulch. That's just not going to be conducive and sustainable moving forward.
So I have a question. Is that the area that you're talking about under a tree or under other kind of plants?
See, that's a nuance.
Okay. So it's a mixed xeriscape landscape, and so I'm glad you said it depends, and it does depend. But I think in the future we may also be looking for stacking plants a little bit more at different canopy heights and cover the surface that way, rather than just relying on mulch for all these individually planted trees that are standing there like little sentries and have to fight on their own. So I think there is, you hear it once in a while from designers already, but I think there will be a change in how the landscapes will be designed. So in the area where you have bare soil, depending on if you're trying to prevent erosion or just trying to reduce the surface temperature, it depends how much water you have available. You can put in some temporary cover crops, and then you could just mow those down before and use them essentially as living mulch, and then use them as mulch, as you cut them down to just naturally decompose. That is one area. Are you trying to prevent erosion? Do you maybe need some kind of ground covers that would spread their roots and keep the soil in place? So it really depends on a situation and how much water you have available to keep a plant cover alive. But even under a tree, grass, we know, is not one of the best options around a tree, because the grass roots are so competitive for both the water and the nutrients. But there may be some other ground cover that you could plant a little bit away from the tree trunk that could eventually cover the area and essentially help shade it and cool it a little bit. But at the same time, you need then a little more water, for that ground cover. So like Leslie said, there are all these pros and cons.
It's like Space Odyssey.
So
Mike
we've
is
got
coming.
2 over here on the chat, and I just want to remind people that please take conversations outside the room so the people who want to listen can listen and hear. I'm going to go ahead and hand this over.
Great, thank you. All right, so the first question from the chat is, how concerned should we be with African rue in southern New Mexico and the best management practices for that?
As far as how concerned to be, it is moving across the southern portion of the states at a pretty good clip, I would say. It's also moving north throughout the state. It's moving along with some of the traffic that we have on I-25, moving with climate change, as I mentioned earlier. As far as the primary concerns with African rue, that's going to be the difficulty in controlling it and the toxicity factors. African rue has 4 separate alkaloids, meaning that it's going to be toxic to a wider range of organisms. It's pretty much toxic to anything that consumes it. So that includes humans, that includes birds, livestock as well, and it's pretty much all parts of the plant are toxic. It's difficult to control because it is a hardy, woody plant. It has a pretty deep, woody root system, which making it hard to kill. So timing is going to be of the essence there. Applications in the fall, secondary applications in the spring are going to be much more successful. And the active ingredients that are usually utilized for that are going to be a mixture of imazapyr and glyphosate. It's just sort of keeping on top of them, making the applications at the appropriate time, trying to prevent the further spread of those infestations as much as possible, and that's pretty much all we're going to have at our disposal there. Yes. Oh,
okay, next question.
Awesome. The next question, they ask, going back to aphids.
Marisa, there's a question down here, I think.
Okay, this next question says, going back to aphids, what weather conditions favor aphid populations more? Also, can frequent light watering contribute to a higher population versus deep, infrequent watering?
Well, they're going to be active when it's warm, you know, spring, summer. I mean, it depends on the species too. Like some have multiple generations, you know, some just have a couple. So it just really depends on the species. But like as far as watering them, like that's not going to make their population go up. It's, you know, if you're knocking them off, that's beneficial. So yeah.
Irrigation-wise, you would always do what is going to be more beneficial for the tree itself. It's my understanding that that's going to be deep, infrequent irrigation rather than shallow irrigation. That's going to be the case for most plants, I believe. But anything that you can do to improve the health and structure of the tree is probably going to be the best thing you can do to avoid any kind of pest interactions, even aphids.
Yes.
Cool.
Over here. How important are community-driven efforts versus individual efforts when it comes to pest management in, say, like a small town?
Repeat the question, please.
How important are community-driven efforts versus the individual efforts in pest management in like a small town, for example?
Well, it depends. I think both are really important, right? Coming together as a community, I think, has more impact, right? Because then you can educate each other. But it starts with the individual for sure. And in a small town, I think it is wonderful once you start, you know, getting individuals developing into some sort of community to do that. So it kind of, you know, works both ways.
I was going to add on to that. I think it would probably be a little bit more preferable to have sort of a community effort going on. When you're talking about pests, if you have one person on your block that does not control a single weed in their landscape and you have people on the sides of them that do, obviously there's going to be movement of one pest from one area of the other despite the best efforts of the individual. So if there's something from a universal standpoint or a more widespread standpoint to address the problem together, it's less likely that you're going to continually reintroduce that problem for people or in instances where maybe there's not a whole lot of focus. So that's one of the aspects of IPM that I always focus on, especially in agricultural fields, focusing on the ditch banks, focusing on the roadsides, focusing on the areas around the field just as much as they would within the field there. And I think that's pretty applicable to all pests.
No, that does make sense. So, you know, you want to like know the information, but then, you know, it is good when you have a lot of people that are working together because it'll be more effective and you won't have that, well, my neighbor doesn't do that, right? So that could probably help with that type of issue.
And a lot of those might start as individual efforts and then expand into a community effort.
Yeah.
Can we get a mic over here to this gentleman, please?
Yeah.
Don't make me tell another joke.
Hey, I'm from Southwest Colorado. Been working in various places trying to manage tamarisk and Russian olive.
Okay, cool.
And I just wondered, you know, this kind of tried and true stuff that I've been doing for 15 years. But Are there any new things in the state of New Mexico or Tucson or whatever to manage those two species? And then there's the willow flycatcher and all that stuff. But any cutting edge insights? I'm looking for.
Thank you. So as far as like tamarisk and Russian olive goes, there's a lot of community-wide efforts for those, especially from like the bureaus of land management, the soil and water conservation districts. There are programs there. As far as new and developing things within research, within the last 6 years, we conducted a research study following injury with the tamarisk leaf beetle. So basically following a defoliation event from the tamarisk beetles with typical management practices like herbicides, like mowing, like grubbing. In some cases, we didn't test it, of course, but fire. So combining those practices together, we were actually able to kill trees. And so we don't necessarily have that presence within Russian olive itself. So it's my understanding that there is a lot of focus on timing with a lot of the suckers that are coming up post-management strategy. What that timing is, I'd have to do a little bit more research and get back to you if you want to shoot me an email. But there are pinpointed timings of when those suckers are coming up that they can be injured, especially with herbicides, to much greater effect to the underground root system of the tree than has been used previously. So as far as like new herbicides or anything like that, we really don't have anything on that scope. But I will say from a new perspective, there have been a lot of efforts that have been put into place, programs through the soil and water conservation districts that are really trying to address these problems on a community scale and bringing the community in to that management. So I think that's going to help kind of give us a leg up in that as well. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. 100%. Yeah, please do. And I can also direct you to our range specialists who might have a little bit more nuanced information on that than probably I would, because I typically focus more on the agronomic side of things. But the research that we had following the injury with the salt cedar leaf beetles was actually surprisingly successful in following that initial injury with traditional management practices. Even if it didn't outright kill the tree, it was obvious that the injury was so much more significant than it was just outright.
All right, so Dr. Hendrickson mentioned that the New Mexico rivers are most endangered in the United States. Do you know of any statewide efforts to add trees along the river or other efforts for biological rehydration? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't know of any.
As far as like trees along the riverbanks, the primary problem with that is going to be a lot of those trees are going to be consistent of salt cedars and Russian olives who are taking advantage of those high water resources. The problem with that and why there's so many community efforts together to try to eradicate these trees as much as possible is with salt cedar especially, it's changing the physical and chemical compositions of the soil around it. Every time the leaves fall to the ground, they're salty. They actually breathe salts out into the soil. And so there are really trying to focus on remediation efforts to deal with these salt deposits as much as possible, because unfortunately, when you start changing the physical and chemical compositions of the soil, you just can't get back to that native state, even with long-standing reclamation efforts. So certainly there's a focus on trying to refocus those tree populations back to our native trees like cottonwoods, like desert willows, things along those lines, but unfortunately it's not as easy as it sounds, because you're already dealing with a situation that fosters the weedy trees and not necessarily the trees that we want. So in answer to your question, yes, there are efforts that are present. What those specific programs I'm not sure. You might check with your local soil and water conservation districts and your local BLMs and see what kind of programs they have together, and also more importantly, how you as a citizen can help.
Interestingly enough, just a real quick side note, having floated down the Rio Grande from Bernalillo down into northern Albuquerque a few years ago, I was surprised at the number of self-seeded, wild-growing green ash, catalpa, and London plane trees. So even without us trying to do things, nature is doing things. And we have introduced all these species that are not native, but how long do you stay in a place before you're native? How many generations does it take to earn the native badge? And we've got trees, Siberian elm. That's the tree that owns Albuquerque. I recently read something that geneticists who study Siberian elm say that New Mexico is the genetic diversity hotspot for Siberian elm in the North American continent. If we could come back 30 million years from now, the woody flora that we would see would be largely evolved from Siberian elm and probably Russian olive and maybe a few natives. But, you know, nature doesn't stand still. We look for a point in time and we try to keep it. Nature doesn't do it.
So if we go back in time and step on a bug, we can avoid Siberian elm altogether?
Hey, I used to run fire out for Canyonlands National Park, and we had a fire going there along the Colorado River just to address why it's good to get rid of Russian olive and tamarisk. And the park resource managers wanted cottonwood galleries as places to get away from the shade, as a natural site, as preserving native vegetation and fauna. And when a fire hits that stuff, it is so hot, and it doesn't really spread. You got a river on one side and desert on the other, but it is so hot that it really hits any kind of native vegetations and removes a lot of 150-year-old, 100-year-old broadleaf cottonwoods, Fremont, you know, and so, and I think too, what we're going to see is in towns and cities where you have this right next to homes and everything else, that we're going to more and more see it become a venue for like Palisades or Paradise, California kind of stuff. It's really hot, really hard to put out.
Okay, as the moderator and with less than 8 minutes left before the next talk, we're done. Thank you all very much. And yeah, go hit the bathroom real quick and come back.